Click below for your copy of The World in 2018, Dr. Friedman's exclusive look at the global dysfunction that will characterize the upcoming year. Click below now. It is believed to be one of the most disastrous failures of U.S. intelligence in recent years. Earlier this week, U.S. federal authorities arrested a former CIA officer a few moments after his flight from Hong Kong landed at New York's JFK airport. The former CIA officer, Jerry Chun-Sing Lee, has been charged with retaining classified information. It's alleged Lee passed top-secret information about CIA agents in China onto Chinese authorities, resulting in the deaths and jailing of some 20 American spies. Here to discuss this is the geopolitical master himself, Dr. George Friedman. George, thank you so much for joining me. This is a very serious subject. If these charges are true for Mr. Lee, how serious do you believe this breach is?
Well, we don't know anything about who these operatives were, what they were tasked to do, how highly they were connected. Not clear how 20 agents were known by one American operator who was allowed out of the country. Normally, if you're going to give him all that information, he doesn't go anywhere. There's a lot of things we don't know about this. As to whether it's disastrous, well, whoever is saying that it's disastrous knows a lot more than has been published in the newspapers, because nothing indicates the importance of the American operation. So we don't know what was compromised.
Interesting. Okay. Well, the word disastrous has been used by, I believe, the New York Times and the BBC. So whoever they're getting their information from. Now, my question to you. Let's peel back a little bit. First off, somebody like Mr. Lee, can you talk a little bit about what his background, typical background of someone who's being recruited to the CIA? Where do these people come from when the CIA are looking for, intelligence operatives, for spies?
Well, the University of Nebraska, and that's not a joke. I mean, Americans are recruited to become intelligence officers. They are normally American-born, and this is a huge problem of American intelligence, which is when you operate in a foreign country, it is helpful to have not just a linguistic understanding, but really a cultural understanding to try to figure out whether the guy's lying or not. Sometimes they recruit people who are from China, or their parents were from China or something like that. I assume that was the case with Mr. Lee. I don't know his background. And they use him because he has such knowledge. Now, the question becomes, have they recruited a Chinese double, somebody who was sent here to be recruited? Is it a straight up American citizen who is then recruited by the Chinese? You don't know. And when I keep saying you don't know, okay, there's a kind of rule that you have to operate by. Intelligence, those who talk don't know. Those who know don't talk. So I don't know who fed that information to the Times, but I will bet you whoever it was someone who wanted them to know a certain story, and that the story was that this was disastrous. And it may well be that for various reasons, CIA wants the Chinese to think this was very disastrous. The Chinese now trying to figure out who these people were that were arrested. Were these really American agents? Were they set up to look like American agents? Who was Lee actually working for? And why the Americans making such a big deal about how terrible this was, when normally if it's terrible, you don't make a big deal. You can spend a lot of time wondering about these things. And one of the problems of intelligence is you spend so much time wondering about these things, these spy versus spy things, you forget that the main goal is to gather information.
So clearly Mr. Lee must have felt like he was in a safe position, given the fact that he was flying from Hong Kong to JFK in New York City. What is the fact that he was coming back to the U.S., if indeed he was working for the Chinese? What does that tell you about what he believed was going on in this particular situation?
Well, there are a number of explanations. One, he's stupid. He probably isn't. Two, he came back thinking he was safe because his cover wasn't blown. Three, he came back because he was working for the CIA and he was doing everything he did to screw the Chinese head. He was then arrested because everybody wanted the Chinese to think that the people they arrested were American spies. So again, it's really important to bear in mind that at this moment, one of the goals of both sides is to totally confuse the other. The Americans want to confuse the Chinese as to whether or not they actually were successful in breaking the operation. Chinese want to confuse the Americans into either thinking that the information they got was great or that it wasn't. Everybody's going to spending their time trying to confuse everybody. And the last thing that's going to be published is the truth in New York Times.
Okay, what do you think, when you look at somebody like Mr. Lee, what do you think happens to flip someone from one side to the other? Can you go through, some of the scenarios as to how they typically go? Obviously, these charges with Mr. Lee, we're alleging everything. But if it's true that he flipped from the U.S. to China, what kind of enticements would China use to flip an American operative?
Well, assume that the story is correct. He is an American intelligence officer. One way is to put him in a compromising position, either sexual or otherwise, and use that to blackmail him. You got to have some really amazing stuff to get an American intelligence officer to betray himself to China because he's going to be caught, and it's pretty bad. Another way is to plant him in the beginning, to send him to the United States, send his parents to the United States, to have them have children. I know of one case in the newspapers of a Russian operative who came to the United States, never spoke Russian at home, had 2 children who didn't know they were Russian, worked with his wife, and for 10 years recruited people very effectively. So if you are really doing this for real, you're prepared to let this project nurture itself for a very long time. And the Chinese could have sent him over here hoping that he got a job with the CIA and then hoping he went back. It's, again, also possible this was carefully nurtured by the Americans to have the Chinese think this was a major operation, spend their counterintelligence time going after them, and miss some other operation that we really cared about. As I said, back to the point, it's hard to tell what exactly it was because the point on both sides is to keep you confused.
Asking a bit of a broader question here, how important are intelligence officers on the ground in countries like China? How important are they to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Interests, around the world?
Well, it varies. I mean, the classic was the Soviet penetration of the Manhattan Project that allowed them to steal the plans for the atomic bomb. It's hard to imagine a more important operation than that one, okay? And for every one of those, there are 5,000 that yield nothing and are not important. The real problem you have is knowing which one matters and which one doesn't. The Manhattan Project could have been a complete bust simply by the U.S. picking up 1 or 2 of the operatives. Some other operation that failed could have given us the gold standards, but remember the most important thing. The United States has been penetrated by Aldrich Ames, who was operating as an analyst in the Soviet section of the CIA, and Robert Hansen, who was heading up, I believe, the counterintelligence section in the FBI. In other words, the Soviets had penetrated us as completely as you could be penetrated. They still collapsed. So for all the success of that, for all the success in intelligence, it may be that it just doesn't matter to what's really historical. Sometimes Manhattan Project, it is. Sometimes it isn't. And you're going to spend an awful lot of time and a vast amount of money failing to do anything important.
Final question for you. If it turns out that these charges against Mr. Lee are true, and in fact he was working for China, what do you think is going to happen to him?
Well, he's going to get a long prison sentence. And the CIA is going to go back step by step through everything he touched, trying to figure out what else he gave away to the Chinese, to others, who else might be working in the CIA. You'll have a witch hunt. In fact, that witch hunt may well be underway already. We don't know. But if it turns out, and the CIA is really not going to depend on whether a court convicts him or not. They already have a pretty good idea of who he is and what he is. They're taking apart his entire life to try to figure out who else was there.
Click below for your copy of The World in 2018, Dr. Friedman's exclusive look at the global dysfunction that will characterize the upcoming year. Click below now.